November, 1943. Port of New York. United States of America. The gray transport ship drifted slowly toward the harbor as hundreds of German prisoners crowded against the railings. Weeks earlier, they had been fighting across the deserts of North Africa and the mountains of Sicily. Now, exhausted and uncertain, they stared silently at a skyline unlike anything they had ever imagined. None of them knew exactly where they were going. Most believed they would spend the rest of the war inside a prison camp surrounded by barbed wire. Some feared revenge. Others expected hunger. Many had been told that American cities were fragile, their factories few in number, and their people unprepared for a long war. But as the morning fog lifted, those beliefs began to disappear. Towering cranes stretched across the harbor. Freighters waited in long lines to unload cargo. Dozens of tugboats moved with astonishing precision. Warehouses seemed to continue endlessly along the waterfront. One prisoner quietly whispered to the man beside him, "How can one city have so many ships?" No one answered, because they were all wondering the same thing. What these prisoners could not yet understand was that they had just arrived in the heart of the greatest industrial machine the world had ever seen. Over the coming months, many of them would witness factories that produced aircraft faster than Germany could replace them, railroads that never seemed to stop moving, and farms capable of feeding entire armies with ease. Some would later admit that their first glimpse of America shattered years of wartime propaganda. Before the war, German military planners had admired American manufacturing but believed the nation lacked the determination to fight a prolonged conflict. Even after the United States entered the war, many German soldiers heard reassuring claims from newspapers and military broadcasts. American factories, they were told, depended on luxury rather than efficiency. Its workers lacked discipline. Its economy would eventually collapse under the demands of global war. The stories sounded convincing. After all, few ordinary soldiers had ever seen America with their own eyes. Instead, they relied upon carefully controlled information. Many imagined the United States as wealthy but soft, powerful but inexperienced, capable of building automobiles, perhaps, but not enough weapons to defeat the combined industries of Europe. Those assumptions followed countless prisoners across the Atlantic. The voyage itself reinforced their uncertainty. Packed tightly aboard converted troop transports, German prisoners crossed thousands of miles under constant guard. Most had never sailed beyond Europe. The Atlantic seemed endless. Each sunrise brought only more water. Each sunset raised new questions. Where exactly were they being taken? How many camps existed? Would they ever see home again? The guards revealed almost nothing. Their orders remained simple. Maintain security. Provide food. Continue west. Several prisoners later recalled that the American sailors appeared surprisingly calm throughout the voyage. There was no sense of panic. No visible shortage of supplies. Meals arrived on schedule. Medical personnel treated both Allied soldiers and prisoners alike. The routine seemed almost effortless. Some Germans assumed this was merely for appearances. They believed conditions would worsen after arrival. Instead, the opposite happened. As the transport entered New York Harbor, nearly every prisoner rushed onto the open deck. The first thing they noticed was movement. Everywhere. Cargo ships unloaded steel. Tankers delivered fuel. Passenger liners departed for distant ports. Construction crews repaired docks without interrupting nearby traffic. Massive cranes lifted equipment that required entire teams of men back in Europe. The harbor operated like an enormous machine whose individual parts never stopped moving. One former artillery officer later admitted that he had expected a busy port. He had not expected an entire coastline devoted to industry. Above everything stood the skyline. Steel towers climbed into the clouds. Smoke drifted from distant factories. Rail lines disappeared beneath bridges before emerging again farther inland. Even from the harbor, the city appeared endless. Several prisoners instinctively searched for bomb damage. They found none. Unlike many European cities, America had fought the war without seeing enemy bombers overhead. Its factories continued operating day and night. Its railways expanded instead of shrinking. Its power stations remained untouched. To men who had watched cities across Europe burn, the contrast felt almost unreal. Within hours, the prisoners boarded long trains waiting near the docks. Again they expected overcrowded freight cars. Instead they found passenger coaches. The journey continued westward. For many Germans, the train ride became just as surprising as the harbor itself. Mile after mile, they passed factories larger than entire military bases. Steel mills glowed through the night. Freight yards stretched beyond the horizon. Rows of identical freight cars carried tanks, trucks, aircraft engines, and ammunition in every direction. One prisoner counted locomotives until he finally gave up. There were simply too many. The trains rarely stopped. Whenever one disappeared around a curve, another emerged moments later. American railroads seemed to operate without interruption. German engineers among the prisoners watched carefully. Several had worked in transportation before the war. They understood logistics. They knew how difficult it was to move enormous quantities of equipment over long distances. What they witnessed exceeded anything they had previously imagined. At every major junction, fresh cargo already waited. Coal, steel, timber, oil, food, finished vehicles. Everything flowed continuously. There appeared to be no bottlenecks, no delays, no shortage of locomotives. One railway worker quietly remarked that Germany could never have supplied so many trains with enough fuel. His companions nodded silently. The farther inland they traveled, the more astonishing the scenery became. Factories gave way to farmland. Not scattered fields divided by ancient stone walls. Instead, vast stretches of cultivated land extended toward distant horizons. Large tractors replaced horses. Mechanical harvesters moved steadily across open fields. Grain elevators towered beside rail lines ready for shipment. Even prisoners raised on farms struggled to comprehend the scale. One former farmer from Bavaria later admitted that a single American farm appeared capable of producing more food than several villages combined. The realization disturbed him. Germany had entered the war believing economic strength could eventually overcome its enemies. Yet every passing mile suggested exactly the opposite. The United States possessed not only enormous resources but also the ability to move them with extraordinary efficiency. As evening approached, the train slowed near one of the largest manufacturing districts many prisoners had ever seen. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys. Bright furnaces illuminated the night sky. Assembly lines operated behind enormous factory windows long after darkness had fallen. The guards explained little. They did not need to. The evidence surrounded everyone on the train. America was building something. And it was building it without pause. Some prisoners guessed automobiles. Others believed trucks. Only later would many discover that these same factories produced bombers, tanks, artillery pieces, engines, and countless other machines destined for battlefields across the world. For the first time since their capture, genuine doubt spread among the prisoners. If one nation could manufacture equipment on such a scale while remaining untouched by enemy bombing, how could Germany hope to keep pace? No speeches were necessary. No propaganda films. The factories themselves answered the question. And for many German prisoners looking through those train windows, the war suddenly appeared very different from the one they thought they had been fighting. Part 2. Within days, the trains carrying German prisoners reached camps scattered across the American countryside. Many expected towering walls, armed watchtowers on every corner, and harsh treatment from angry civilians whose sons were fighting overseas. Instead, they found something they had not prepared themselves for. Order. The camps were surrounded by fences and guarded carefully, but they were also clean, organized, and remarkably efficient. Rows of identical wooden barracks stretched across neatly planned compounds. Water towers overlooked the camp. Medical buildings stood beside dining halls. Storage warehouses remained full of supplies. Everything appeared to have been designed for speed, function, and routine. One former German sergeant quietly observed that the camp looked less like a temporary prison and more like a small military town. For men who had spent years watching Europe consume itself through destruction, the difference was impossible to ignore. The routines began immediately. Morning roll call. Breakfast. Assigned work details. Medical inspections. Mail distribution. Everything operated according to schedule. Nothing seemed rushed. Nothing appeared disorganized. Even the guards moved with quiet confidence, as though shortages were something they had never experienced. Many prisoners remained suspicious. Surely this was temporary. Surely the Americans could not maintain such abundance while fighting a global war. Then came their first work assignments. Because millions of American men were serving overseas, farms, factories, railroads, and lumber operations faced severe labor shortages. Rather than leaving prisoners idle, American authorities assigned many of them to supervised work crews. It was during these assignments that countless German prisoners received their greatest surprise. They expected struggling factories desperately trying to meet wartime demand. Instead, they discovered industrial systems operating on a scale beyond anything they had imagined. One group arrived at a tractor manufacturing plant. Before entering the building, several prisoners estimated its size. They assumed it contained a few hundred workers. They were wrong. Inside, thousands of men and women worked with astonishing coordination. Steel entered at one end. Finished machines emerged from the other. Assembly lines stretched so far across the factory floor that the opposite wall disappeared beneath cranes, overhead conveyors, and endless rows of machinery. Every few minutes another completed vehicle rolled forward. No one shouted. No one appeared confused. Each worker repeated carefully practiced movements with remarkable precision. The entire building seemed alive. A German machinist who had spent years working in a factory near Stuttgart later admitted that he had never imagined production on such a scale. The factory where he had worked suddenly seemed tiny by comparison. Elsewhere, prisoners assigned to railroad maintenance witnessed another lesson in American logistics. Freight trains passed almost continuously. Coal trains, oil trains, livestock trains, flat cars carrying tanks covered beneath canvas. Long strings of boxcars loaded with wooden crates marked only by military shipping codes. The traffic never appeared to slow. Switching yards operated throughout the day and well into the night. Signals changed. Locomotives moved. Fresh cargo replaced departing trains almost immediately. One former railway engineer quietly calculated the number of freight cars moving through a single junction during one afternoon. The figure seemed impossible. He checked his count again. The result remained the same. Germany would have required several major rail networks to match what one American yard handled in a day. Perhaps the greatest shock came not from weapons factories but from ordinary civilian life. During supervised transport between worksites, prisoners occasionally passed through nearby towns. Shop windows remained full. Restaurants served customers. Children rode bicycles along quiet streets. Automobiles filled parking lots. Construction crews continued building new homes. Even during wartime, everyday life continued with extraordinary normality. Several prisoners found this almost impossible to understand. Europe had become accustomed to shortages. Ration books. Blackouts. Bomb damage. Constant uncertainty. America appeared to be fighting the same war while living in an entirely different reality. One prisoner later remembered seeing fresh fruit stacked outside a grocery store. Not a small display. Entire rows. He stood staring until a guard quietly instructed him to keep walking. He had not seen such abundance in years. The psychological effect proved surprisingly powerful. Many German soldiers had entered captivity believing the United States possessed greater wealth but lacked endurance. Now they witnessed a nation producing enormous quantities of military equipment, while ordinary citizens still enjoyed comforts that had disappeared from Europe long before. Those observations slowly changed conversations inside the camps. At first, prisoners spoke cautiously. Perhaps these prosperous regions represented unusual exceptions. Perhaps only certain factories operated so efficiently. Yet every new work assignment revealed similar patterns. Abundance, organization, relentless production. One camp interpreter noticed an interesting change. Letters written home gradually contained fewer confident predictions about Germany's eventual victory. Instead, many prisoners asked their families about shortages, factory conditions, and Allied bombing. They had begun comparing what they remembered with what they now witnessed every day. The contrast grew increasingly difficult to ignore. One afternoon, a group of prisoners worked near an aircraft assembly facility. From outside the perimeter fence, they watched enormous sections of bombers moving steadily between buildings. Fuselages, wings, engines, landing gear. Each component arrived exactly when needed. Nothing remained idle. Nothing waited for missing parts. By the end of the day, completed aircraft rolled toward nearby airfields for testing. One former Luftwaffe mechanic stood silently for several minutes. He had spent years repairing damaged German aircraft. He knew how long complex maintenance required. Watching completely new bombers emerge from assembly lines at such speed left him speechless. A fellow prisoner finally asked what he was thinking. His answer was short. If they build them this quickly, how can anyone destroy them fast enough? No one replied. Because everyone already understood the question. The realization spread slowly but relentlessly. The war was no longer being decided only on battlefields. It was being decided inside factories, on railroad networks, at steel mills, in shipyards, across endless farms. Every train they watched, every assembly line they observed, every warehouse they passed pointed toward the same conclusion. America's greatest weapon was not a single aircraft, not one tank, not one battleship. It was the astonishing ability to produce all of them simultaneously. For many German prisoners, that understanding became impossible to escape. They had crossed an ocean expecting imprisonment. Instead, they found themselves witnessing an industrial machine unlike anything they had ever believed possible. And the longer they remained in the United States, the more one unsettling thought continued growing in their minds. If this was only a small glimpse of America's true production capacity, what must the rest of the country look like? Part 3. As the months passed, life inside the prisoner camps settled into a routine. The uncertainty that had filled the first days slowly gave way to observation. German prisoners began paying attention to details they had once ignored. The number of freight trains passing each morning. The endless columns of trucks moving along American highways. The speed with which bridges, roads, and warehouses seemed to appear. Every week revealed another piece of a puzzle they had never expected to solve. Many prisoners eventually realized that America's industrial strength did not come from one extraordinary factory. It came from millions of ordinary people performing ordinary jobs with remarkable consistency. Steel workers poured molten metal day and night. Farmers harvested crops using machines that covered enormous fields with astonishing speed. Railroad crews kept thousands of locomotives moving across the continent. Shipyard workers launched new cargo vessels almost faster than newspapers could report them. Each industry depended upon another. Coal powered the furnaces. Steel built the factories. Factories produced the machines. Railroads delivered those machines across the nation. Ports loaded them onto ships bound for Europe and the Pacific. It was one enormous system. And every part appeared to support the next. For soldiers who had fought through years of shortages, the scale remained almost impossible to comprehend. Several prisoners assigned to agricultural work noticed another surprising difference. American farms rarely relied upon large numbers of laborers. Instead, powerful machines performed tasks that required dozens of workers back home. Tractors plowed fields stretching toward distant horizons. Mechanical combines harvested grain with astonishing efficiency. Automatic equipment sorted crops before they even reached storage. One former farmer later admitted that he spent his first weeks studying the machines more closely than the fields themselves. He had never imagined agriculture operating almost like a factory. The lesson was impossible to ignore. A nation capable of feeding itself so easily could devote far more resources to war production. Meanwhile, prisoners working near manufacturing centers continued witnessing extraordinary scenes. Entire trains arrived carrying raw steel. Only days later, similar trains departed carrying tanks, trucks, aircraft engines, artillery pieces, and military equipment. The transformation happened with breathtaking speed. Nothing seemed wasted. Nothing remained idle. Factory whistles echoed across industrial districts from dawn until late into the evening. Shift replaced shift. Production never truly stopped. One former German engineer quietly remarked that the factories resembled living organisms. Even when individual workers left for home, the machines continued through the next shift without interruption. That observation stayed with many prisoners long after the war ended. Inside the camps, discussions slowly changed. Early conversations had focused upon escape, military news, rumors from Europe, predictions about Germany's next offensive. Now different questions appeared. How many aircraft could America actually build? How many ships were leaving its ports every month? Could Germany ever hope to destroy enough factories to slow this production? No one possessed exact answers. But the estimates grew larger every week. Even the camp libraries contributed unexpectedly to changing opinions. American newspapers often reported production achievements with remarkable openness. Photographs showed assembly lines stretching through enormous factories. Launch ceremonies celebrated newly completed cargo ships. Articles described automobile plants converted into aircraft production. Prisoners compared those reports with everything they witnessed outside the camp fences. The stories matched reality. If anything, the newspapers understated the sheer scale. One evening, an older German officer addressed several younger prisoners gathered inside a barracks. He had served since before the war and remained deeply loyal to his country. For months, he dismissed every discussion about American industry as exaggeration. That night his tone changed. Quietly, almost reluctantly, he admitted something few expected to hear. We underestimated them. The room fell silent. No one argued. Because by then, nearly everyone had reached the same conclusion. Many prisoners later described that realization as more unsettling than capture itself. Capture affected individuals. Industrial superiority affected entire nations. It suggested that regardless of courage, tactics, or battlefield victories, one side possessed resources on a scale the other simply could not match. As Allied armies advanced across Europe during the final year of the war, the evidence became impossible to deny. New aircraft continued arriving. Fresh trucks filled military highways. Replacement equipment appeared almost immediately after heavy fighting. American production seemed endless. Some prisoners wondered how long such an effort could continue. The answer surprised them once again. Even after years of war, construction projects still expanded. Factories hired additional workers. Railroads added new equipment. Ports handled even greater quantities of cargo. The industrial machine did not appear exhausted. It appeared to be growing stronger. When news finally reached the camps that Germany had surrendered, reactions varied. Some prisoners felt relief. Others experienced grief and uncertainty. Many worried about families waiting in ruined cities thousands of miles away. Yet among those emotions existed another feeling rarely discussed. Understanding. Months spent observing America had gradually changed the way many prisoners viewed the conflict. Victory had not depended upon one decisive battle, nor one brilliant commander, nor one revolutionary weapon. Instead, it emerged from an extraordinary combination of manufacturing, transportation, agriculture, engineering, and organization working together toward a single purpose. Years later, former prisoners reflected upon their experiences in interviews and memoirs. Many spoke about the camps. Others remembered the kindness of individual guards or American families they encountered during supervised work assignments. But a surprising number returned to the same memory. Their first encounter with American industry. The endless freight trains. The giant factories. The crowded shipyards. The highways filled with trucks. The farms stretching beyond the horizon. Those images remained unforgettable. One former prisoner summarized his experience in a single sentence. "We believed America was rich. We did not understand that it could turn that wealth into production faster than anyone else." Perhaps that explains why the first weeks in the United States proved so important. The prisoners had crossed the Atlantic expecting only captivity. Instead, they witnessed the economic foundation that sustained one of history's largest military efforts. No speech convinced them. No interrogation changed their minds. No propaganda film altered their beliefs. Reality did. Every passing freight train. Every newly completed bomber. Every cargo ship leaving port. Every factory operating through the night. Together, those ordinary sights revealed something extraordinary. The greatest strength of the United States was not simply the machines it built. It was the unmatched ability to keep building them. Again, and again, and again. By the time many German prisoners finally returned home after the war, they carried more than memories of captivity. They carried a new understanding of modern warfare. Battles could decide campaigns. Generals could shape strategy. Soldiers could display remarkable courage. But behind every victory stood an industrial system capable of supplying armies without interruption. For countless German prisoners of war, that lesson began not on a battlefield, but the moment they stepped off a transport ship and saw the endless cranes, factories, railroads and skylines of the United States. Only then did they realize they had not simply entered another country. They had entered the world's greatest industrial powerhouse.